Hi, my name's Duncan from SSW, and in today's Dev Superpowers we're going to be combining two technologies, two of my favorite technologies, both AngularJS and TypeScript. And if you've never watched a Dev Superpowers before, what these webinars are about is about getting our hands dirty and doing a live code demo and a walkthrough. So if you haven't watched or seen the other live webinars we have, I highly recommend you check them out. And one in particular is Ben Cull's the previous Dev Superpowers webinar on AngularJS, which is an introduction to AngularJS. And we're going to extend that application today, and we've got some ambitious goals to be able to convert his little beer application with Angular into, it was using a MVC controller, into using a web API controller, and also, of course, using TypeScript. So we want to have a TypeScript controller, and we also want to add a TypeScript service. So we've got a fair bit to get through in the next 60 minutes or so, and let's jump into it. So if we have a look here, we have a bit of a course outline of what we're going to cover today, and we're going to do a code demo with about 10 steps, building out that web API, and then running through a TypeScript controller and a TypeScript service to extend Ben's application. So let's first go have a look at Ben's application online. So if we jump over here to the website, this is a fantastic webinar from Ben, which is really a good introduction to AngularJS. And I'm going to show you more of this in a second. So if you've never done AngularJS before, I'll highly recommend that you watch this course, because I'm going to assume that you have at least the basics of AngularJS. Even though I'm going to go slowly and talk through what I'm doing, it would help to have the basics understood. If you've never done TypeScript before, that's okay. I'm going to talk through that as well and explain things step by step as I go. But today's talk is a lot of wiring up of the two. So if you have a little bit of a base knowledge, that would be good. So let's jump in and actually have a look at what this application does that we're going to extend today. So I have it open here and running, and we have a very typical looking MVC application, and we have a list of beers. And what we do here with this list of beers is we just do a simple ng repeat with Angular to bring back our beers, and then we have a button that fires off an event to show and hide this beer form to add a new beer. And we can cancel that form. And we've got some Ajax calls in the background to add that beer without having to refresh the page. All the nice goodies that you get with AngularJS. So before we jump in and actually look at the code for this, I wanted to show you a few other little things and references before we do. So one of those things is the style guide by John Papa. And if you haven't seen this, I highly recommend it. It's a very popular style guide on GitHub from one of the kind of authorities on single page applications in AngularJS, which is John Papa. And he goes through and talks a lot about different styles that you should use. And in particular today, we're going to be highlighting a few of those. And one of those is using the controller as syntax. And another one will be putting all of our variables up the top of our controller. And you'll see more as we go through, but I'll be referencing this as we go. Another reference is the definitely typed libraries this is actually a community project on GitHub managed by Boris. And for all the third-party libraries that you might use, JavaScript libraries that is, then there's usually going to be a definitely typed version of that. So the one we're going to be using today is down here, this AngularJS. And we're going to pull that in with NuGet, but I just wanted to show you this site so that you know where that's coming from. And two other little goodies. One is the actual TypeScript site. So TypeScript brag quite heavily here on the front page. They say TypeScript lets you write JavaScript the way you really want to. And I think that's pretty true. If you're coming from, especially if you're coming from a C# background, being able to do things like have classes and inheritance and interfaces, all of these great goodies that we get for building out, enterprise level applications, then you can do that with TypeScript. And I won't show you more here, but you'll see lots of it in the code demo today. So the very last reference I want to show you here is one of the tools that I'm using is Web Essentials. And the reason why Web Essentials is such a handy tool is it allows us to get a double view of our page. We get to see the TypeScript that we're writing, and we get to see the compiled JavaScript next door to it. Every time we push save, Visual Studio will compile the JavaScript and we can see that next door as plain old JavaScript that is compiled out of the TypeScript. So enough of the references, let's jump in and have a look at the back end. So I'm just going to jump over to Visual Studio here and come over to Solution Explorer and just going to close everything down for a second and then open it up. And we have an app folder, and in this app folder we have all of the logic that Ben had made in his other demonstration that I showed you before. And it's pretty simple. We have an app module file and we have a beer controller. And then we have an MVC controller for calling out and getting a list of beers. We have a simple beers model here, which I'll show you very quickly. And we also have down here in our views, we have a beers index.cshtml, which has been wired up to use Angular. So that's the application we're going to start from. And what I'm going to do here, the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a new controller. We want to make a web API controller. So we want to set up a web API and access that. So I'm going to right click on controllers and push add new controller. And we're going to do a web API 2 controller with actions using Entity Framework. So I'll just click add. And we're going to use our beer model. And I'm not going to call it beers 1, I'm actually going to call it beers API controller and push add. And what this is going to do for us, Visual Studio in the background is going to scaffold out a new web API controller off our beers model. So fantastic little Visual Studio goodness here, and we can see we have some simple API we can call that will bring back a list of beers or allow us to post a new beer. And I'm going to push Control F5 here and pop over to the browser, and I'm just going to test that this works. So I'm just going to hit this API directly, call API/beers API, and we can see that we're bringing back a list of beers. We've got 2 beers in here at the moment. And if we pop back over into Visual Studio, the next thing that we want to do is we want to start converting some of this original application here that we have from the previous webinar, in particular this beer controller. We want to convert this beer controller into TypeScript. And valid TypeScript is valid JavaScript, and valid JavaScript is valid TypeScript. So what you can do, the simplest way to get started is to just right click and rename this file and call it beercontroller.ts. If we push enter and agree to change the file name, that's all we need to do. And what you can see, a couple of changes on the screen here, is we get this pane here on the right, which we can move back and forth. This is the Web Essentials tool that I was talking about. And if we click over onto the actual TypeScript file here on the left and push Control S to save, we will get the rendered JavaScript over here on the right. So this is Visual Studio compiling the TypeScript and the Web Essentials plugin to allow us to see the compiled TypeScript over here on the right. And if we, at this stage, we shouldn't have to do anything else. We should just be referencing this over here, this JavaScript, and we should see it on the page. So let's Control F5 to pop back over into the browser, neaten up a little bit here. Push F12 to open our DevTools and hit the beers page, and we see a list of beers. And currently we're bringing those beers back from the MVC controller still, but we're going to change that in a second. But what we can see is we're actually running a TypeScript file here. If we go into our sources and open our app folder and controller, we can see that we have a beercontroller.ts, and we could debug on this and set a breakpoint and be able to use our TypeScript file to do the debugging. So let's pop back over into Visual Studio, and what I'm actually going to do here is just push Shift F5 to stop this, and rather than convert this previous controller we have here using the $scope syntax, It gets quite messy when you're using TypeScript sometimes to refactor a previous JavaScript file, and sometimes I prefer just to put them next door to each other with a new file and just retype it because it's a simpler way to go. So that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to open the Solution Explorer, I'm going to right click on the controllers, and I'm going to add a new TypeScript file, and I'm going to call it beers.controller.ts. And now we have a blank canvas here. And I'm just going to open up our compiled pane so that we can see as we go. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just run through and show you some TypeScript setups. So show you some classes, some modules, and how to use those. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add Angular to it. I am using ReSharper because it makes me feel like a superhero when I code, and especially when I'm doing TypeScript, I find that if I'm using ReSharper, you're going to type more code when you're using TypeScript, and we need to mitigate that as much as we possibly can. So I find when I use ReSharper with TypeScript in Visual Studio, it allows me to save on some of the typing and will pre-type some of that and give me some suggestions. And you're going to see lots of that today. So if I start typing module, you can see ReSharper kicking in and helping here, and I'm going to give this module name app.beers, like so, and then push tab again and pop in. And if I push save right now, you see we get nothing but a source map in our compiled pane over here. So let's keep going. Inside our module, first thing I'm going to do is put a use strict statement, and then I'm going to make an interface. And that interface is going to be iBeers scope. And I'm going to put nothing in there for now. I'm just going to stub out the skeleton. But you can see when I push Control S and save this, what we see over here is we now have our module, our app module, and inside that we have another part called beers. So what we've got here is a global variable called app, and then we have an iffy, an immediately invoked function expression that takes that global variable of app. And then we have another variable called beers, and inside that we have another iffy which takes that beers. So this is how we get our namespacing of app.beers. So let's keep going here, let's keep stubbing this out. I'm going to put in a class for beer, because we're going to have a beer. I'm going to leave that blank for now. And then we're going to put in another class for our controller. And this is going to be called our beers controller. And it's going to implement beers scope. And you can see Intellisense here helping us quite a bit. So I'm just going to push tab and tab and keep going there. And I'm only going to put in the bare basics at the moment. So I'm going to put in a constructor and I'm going to leave it empty. Push save. And now you can see this class. We've put in two things here. We've put in a class for the beers, which is just a function that returns beer. And we put in a beers controller, which is just another function that returns the beer controller. But this interface, I wanted to show you, if I was to have made this beer of type interface, of type iBeer, and push save, and just take this whole class out, push save, we'll see that the interfaces don't get compiled. They're just for the IDE. We don't get any extra code in there for our interfaces. But if I was to put back in the class and just call it beer class and push save, then we will get code for the classes. So I just wanted to highlight that. Going to keep going down here. We've got our beer class. Now I'm going to start wiring up the Angular. So if I was making a stereotypical Angular and TypeScript controller, this is how it would look. So I would go Angular, and you can see here the typing helping out. And you're probably wondering, how do I get such good typing? And I have to stop at this point and say there's something that I haven't shown you yet. When you make a TypeScript project, what you need to do is you need to go off to that site that I showed you before, this definitely typed site, and go get these third-party definitely typed files and include them in your project. And that's why when we're in Visual Studio here, I can do things like go .module, and I get this great IntelliSense telling me, okay, this is a function member that takes a name as a string and then it takes a string array. And the reason we have that is because I've gone over to my Solution Explorer and included in the project down here in the scripts a typings folder. And in there I have an AngularJS and I have all of my angular.d.ts references here. So the way that you get those is you go right click on the project and you go manage NuGet packages. And Visual Studio actually prompts this when you make your first TypeScript file. Do you want to go off to NuGet and get these definitely typed files? So I'm just going to look up AngularJS. And what you'll see down here that I've already installed is AngularJS.TypeScript.definitelyTyped. So you want to go get that and include it in your project. And when you do that, you'll get your typings. So that's why we get such great IntelliSense right now for things like module. And we're going to call our module app. And then we're going to add a controller. And the controller's name is going to be app.beers controller. And it's going to take a beers controller. And you can see the IntelliSense popping up time and time again. You will be typing more code when you do TypeScript with Angular, but the benefit is you end up saving time in the long run with all of these benefits. So I'm just going to go beers, just push tab and insert that beers controller. So this is the bare bones push control save. This is the bare bones of what you would expect to put in an Angular controller. So let's actually go forward now and convert our beer controller from Ben into this controller, our beers.controller.ts file. So I'm just going to give us a bit more space and move this over to the side. Push Alt-W-V to split the screens and just give us about 50-50 here looking at the previous controller and the new one. So what we want to do is we want to come over to this previous controller and we've got two things we're going to do. One, we're going to convert this from using the scope syntax to the controller as syntax, as per John Papper's style guide. And the other thing we're going to be doing is obviously implementing it in TypeScript. So let's put in all of our variables here that we're going to be using. So I'm going to pop back over and into our interface. I'm going to put in a beers variable that takes a beer array as a type. So this is typing this beers variable as of type beer array. And we can do that because this is referencing the class beer below. And I'm just going to populate this beer class. It has an ID, and that ID is of type string. And this beer class, this beer has a name, and it's also going to be of type string. And it has a color of type string, and it has a has tried flag of type Boolean. So now we've got that all typed up, we can keep going here. We're also going to have in our interface a new beer, and that is going to be of type beer. And then we're going to have a flag for showing and hiding the add new beer form, which is going to be called show beer. And that's going to be of type Boolean as well. So they're the variables we're going to have up front. But we also want to add on here a couple of functions, and the first one's going to be called GetBeers. Now we could just say, okay, this is going to be of type function, like so. And that's a very simple way of getting started. But I like to type them out as if the way that I'm going to implement them inside my class or the beer controller class below. So rather than putting control like this, we could also say, I'm going to do a lambda expression for my function, which would be taking no parameters and use the fat arrow to say the return type, and it's going to just return an object like this. So we could do that. But there's even a third way that I prefer, which is to actually just put the brackets right next door and put in a colon and just declare the return type straight after. So this GetBeers is going to actually return an ng.I promise. and this I promise is going to be cast to a type of beer array, like so. Now you're probably going, what's this ng dot stuff? And this is brought in from the Angular definitely typed file. So if we come back here, we could go ng scope, and we would have the scope on there. And then as we go further through and we start actually using this GetBeers function, we're going to get all of the nice strong typing that we can use in our Intellisense inside there. So let's just put that back how it was. ng.iPromise of type beer array. Then we're going to do a very similar one for add beer, which is going to be a function that returns ng.iPromise, and this one's just going to be of type beer, not beer array. And we've got one last function to wire up, and that is the show beer form, and that returns to us void. All it is used to set a true or false flag on it to show and hide the form. And I just forgot, the add beers takes a show beer, and that show beer is of type Boolean. So they're the variables we're going to put in there, and they're the functions we're going to add, which we've taken from looking over here in our previous controller. Now I'm just going to drag this back over so we've got it all on one screen rather than a split screen for a second. And you'll see that we're getting a red warning here from TypeScript. And TypeScript is kind of funny. Here in the office at SSW, we always joke that TypeScript's like visiting your grandmother. And when you visit your grandmother, you know it's awesome, especially when you're a little kid, because you know you're going to be getting cake. But you know there's all these extra rules that you have to abide to. You can't run in the hallways, you have to take your shoes off at the door, and all these different things. And TypeScript's kind of like that. There's all this goodness in it, there's all these extra rules. And you kind of feel that when you first start getting into it, especially when you join it with Angular. As you'll see here, we start getting all these red squigglies everywhere. But they can be a real help rather than a hindrance. So this one's here saying class beer controller declares interface iBeer scope but does not implement it. And that's because we've got all of these things in the interface we're saying we're going to implement that we're not. And I'm going to use resharper here to save me some typing and push Alt-Enter. And it's going to say, do you want to implement the missing members? I'll push Enter. And I'm going to add all of these and push Finish. And it's going to help me out here by typing all that out for me. I still have to implement the actual logic here in these functions, but it's going to type it all out. So next thing I'm going to do is just use another resharper shortcut and go Control-Shift-Alt and push up and move all these above my constructor because I like to have them up top. And push Save, and let's have a look here at our compiled JavaScript. So we can see now we have got a app global variable wrapped in an IFI that's then wrapped in another IFI, and we're passing in app.beers. And then we can see we have a beer function that returns a beer for our class over here of beer, but we have nothing for the interface. That doesn't get typed out. And then we have another function for our beers controller, which is adding on 3 functions onto the beer controller prototype. One is the GetBeers, one is the add-beers, and one is the show-beers. And then we have our Angular wire up at the bottom. Now we have to wire up this Angular stuff at the bottom because we're putting it in a class. Normally in a JavaScript file, this will get hoisted to the top of the file, but in this case it won't, so we have to actually declare it at the bottom. So kind of going against the style guide a little bit, but it's not that big a deal. So let's go implement the rest of this. I'm just going to leave this open to the side so we can see it as we go. So next thing we need is to implement this function here to get beers and call out to our new web API. So in our constructor, this is where we initialize all of our code, we're going to need to have the $HTTP service from Angular. So if I just go, it's going to be a private variable, and it's going to be $HTTP of type ng dot, so we're using our definitely typed file here again, HTTP promise, HTTP service, sorry, so we can see that here. And when we wire up this controller, we're going to do a couple of things. When we initialize the code, we're going to get beers so that we have them on page load. And you can see that we get this .getBeers, so nice Intellisense there. And we're also going to set the property to this show beer boolean. So we're going to go this.show beer is going to equal false. Now we have a problem at the moment in that this code is not minification safe. We're injecting the HTTP service from Angular, but if we minify this code, what will happen is this HTTP might get changed to something like A or B or some shorter syntax, and the JavaScript compiler in the browser won't notice it and it will just not work. So if we also look back at our previous beer controller from the previous webinar converted to TypeScript now, but it's really just still JavaScript in here, this isn't minification safe either. And at the moment we haven't started using this beer controller.ts. We've just started typing it out. We're still using this in our index view. So if I save and run this, it's going to work because the page at the moment is going to bring back the actual JavaScript file or the TypeScript file, and we can use that. But if I went over to the Solution Explorer and I open up the controller, the app start, and go to our bundle.config, I'm actually going to set our debug settings to actually minify everything inside our development environment. So I'm going to just uncomment this code that enables optimizations, which means we're going to minify everything in the browser. So I'm going to Control F5, head back over to the browser and run the application. And I'm going to refresh. And you'll see we're not getting anything back. And that's because if we come down and look at our scripts, everything's been minified in this bundle. And that $HTTP service is just going to be turned into an A or a B or something else as it gets minified. So we need to actually prevent that. So flipping back into Visual Studio, I'm just going to leave this bundling and minification optimizations on so we still minify everything to show you the point. And I'm going to come over to our beer controller. And what we actually need to do is we need to use something called $inject. And because we're using TypeScript, we can actually use a static method for this and go static $inject. And this is an Angular service, and it takes an array of strings for all the things we're putting in, and we're going to inject HTTP service. And if we save that, what you'll see down the bottom is we've been added to this. Shift F5 to stop running it and Control Save. We've added this beers controller $inject equals HTTP. So this is wiring up to make sure that our project is minification safe. And if I was to add the same thing back into the other logic, it would also make that minification safe. If I was to go to our function at the top and add that, we would then have the minification safe. But at this point, what I'm going to do is actually flip over from using this controller to using the new controller, because this one's going to be minification safe. But before we do that, we're going to have to go over to our view and change a few things, because we're using the controller as syntax. So we flip over to our index. If we were to reference, currently we're referencing the old beer controller, and if we wanted to reference the new beers controller, we can't just do this anymore because we've got namespacing. We actually have to go app.beers.beersController, and we could use this. But we're actually not putting things on the scope, we're putting it on the actual controller, so we need to go as VM and use the controller as syntax. And that means we need to put VM in front of all of the things we're binding to on this page. And that's good for a couple of reasons. It's following the best practices in the style guide, but it allows for dotting, and that's going to mean that when we start getting quite a complicated view here with maybe multiple controllers, then rather than just having just a straight beers like this, we can start trying to prevent name collisions by going vm.beers and have this dotting in here. So I'm just going to go through and add the dotting to everything very quickly. We're going to have a vm.beers.length down here, and we're actually not going to have a states anymore. We're going to have a vm.showBeer, and it's actually going to be just a variable showBeer. We're not going to have a new .beer anymore, we're just going to have a new beer. So it'll be vm.newBeer and vm.newBeer over here. And same again for this, vm.newBeer.hasTried. That should be a capital. And then same again, vm.addNewBeer here, and the type we're adding is also going to be a vm.newBeer. vm.showNewBeer equals false. And the very last one, vm.showBeerForm, and push save. So now we should be wired up here to use the new controller and the new controller syntax. But if we try and run this at the moment, we're going to get an error because we haven't made a reference to this new beer controller in our bundling and minification. And this is something I often forget to do. So you load the page up and you see this error and you think, why not? And it's because you haven't made a reference yet on the page to your JavaScript file. So I'm going to go into our bundling and minification. I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to hijack this reference and change it to beers.controller.js. Just check the spelling there. And yep, beers.controller.js. And you can see I'm referencing the JS. So at this point, you're thinking, how can you reference the JavaScript file if it's only got the TypeScript file? And if I show hidden files here, you can see that behind the scenes, Visual Studio has added these JavaScript files for us so we can reference them. Now, this opens another quick question to cover. If you're going to be releasing this to production, most of the time you're probably going to be wanting to include these files in the project so they're available on production. But there's cases where you might not, but usually that's generally what you'll do. But for this demo, I'm just going to leave them as they are. So we have got a reference to this file, we've made our beer controller, and we've implemented our things, and we should be using it, but currently we've got no working functions, but we should be able to load the page and see it working. So if we Control-Shift-B to build, and Control-F5 to run it, open the dev tools so we clear our cache, go to beers, and we're working. No, we've got one error in the console. The GetBeers is throwing a not implemented exception. Well, yep, because we're calling it on load in our constructor, but we're not using it yet. We have nothing implemented. But the good news is we can see that our controller is not throwing any errors, and we've now swapped over. So let's go back into Visual Studio and continue to wire up this controller. So we come down, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, in the constructor here, we're calling our GetBeers method, and at the moment it's throwing a not implemented exception, and we want to change that to actually just bring back a list of beers. And if we're following our style guide, we'll do this in a service, and I'm going to run off and do that in a service after I implement it here first. So first of all, I'm going to implement it in the controller, and then I'll refactor it out into an Angular factory to use a service, which is a much better, more enterprise way of doing it. So let's close our Solution Explorer. I'll keep over the compile pane here so you can see it as we go. And let's wire this up. So I'm just going to get rid of this line, and I'm going to return first of all, I'm going to return this $http.get, and I'm going to call out to our new web API controller, so it's going to be API/beers API like this, and then then you can see Intellisense here kicking in with our definitely typed file, making things nice and easy. So then we're going to bring back a response we'll just bring back the response, and that is going to be of type any for now. And this brings up a good conversation. When should you use any? So I think you should try and use any as little possible of saying this response is of type any, because if you want to get the juiciness of TypeScript, you really want to type as much as possible. And I'm going to come back and retype this in a second to be the right parameter, but at the moment we're saying really that this response we're going to return is a dynamic type. And it's going to be of type any and use a fat arrow because we're using a lambda expression for this function. And then we're just going to set this dot beers to be of type equals, I'm going to cast it to a beer array, and it's just going to be of type response dot data, like so. Oh, got the angle bracket on the wrong side there. So response dot data. And now you see that Visual Studio is not showing any more red squigglies, and we could use this. But like I said, I'm going to try and type everything as much as possible. So I'm actually going to change this response to actually bring back a type of ng dot, and this is another big help of the definitely typed library. Never remember this one, but I know it's got a call back of some description in the word, IHTTP callback arg, that's what we wanted, and that's going to be of type beer array, like so. So now I can strongly type what I expect to come back from this response. And I can probably come in here as well and go call this a beer array. But what you're actually seeing here is correct, and if I push Control S, we'll see it's working and it's compiling, but this is actually resharper throwing up a bit of an issue here. And 9 times out of 10, resharper is amazing and saves me lots of time. And in this case, it's something that I can't just turn off in the settings. I could come back and just call it an any, which I'm actually going to do for the rest of this course. But normally I'll just roll it and call it beer, bring it back as a beer array or an array of beers. But just so we don't get the red squigglies in our face for now, I'm going to call it an any. So this should be enough. This should be working. It should make a call for us, and we should getting a list of beers back. So let's Control F5, go back over to the view and have a look. So bring back beers, open our dev tools so that we refresh our cache and refresh. And it's saying that we're still getting this GetBeers not implemented error. So I've got a feeling that our TypeScript didn't compile. So I'll come back over, Shift F5, Control Shift Build, Control Save, and have a look over and make sure that that's working for us. So, what I've done, silly me, is I've added it to the add beer method. So I'm just going to steal all that and just whack it up here in our other method for now. So what our GetBeers is doing is the exact same thing, but now we've got it in the right place. Push save, make sure that's compiled for us, and hasn't yet. So come back over, Control save, Control build. Sometimes I find I need to build to actually get it to do its thing. But at the moment when we look over at our GetBeers, it's not compiling. And I've got a feeling we've probably got some errors, and we do. So if we have a look, incorrectly implementing IBR scope. And this is an example of TypeScript saving you time by having to go debug in the browser to see what's going wrong. And because I'm trying to add to this add beer method a return a promise that brings back an array of beers, but it shouldn't be, because up here I've typed it to be new beer just brings back a promise of bring back a beer, versus the GetBeers is bring back a beer array. So I'm going to come down here, and just for now I'm just going to comment this out. And just say it returns for now. And save. So we haven't implemented that, but we can see that we shouldn't have any errors. Control Shift Build. Oh, we're still getting some errors in here. So I'm just going to go and type this out now. So I'll uncomment this. What we'll do is we'll implement this one to do a post, because this one is actually going to post to our beers controller, and it's going to post up a new beer. like so. But we actually need to put in here, takes a parameter of new beer. And I'll quickly realize up here, I meant to put this show beer boolean into the show beer form function, and the add beer should be taking a new beer. So if we look at all this now, we're still getting a bit of an error. Class beers controller incorrectly implements the interface. GetBeers are incompatible with type beer. So if we come up and we look at our GetBeers, our GetBeers should be bringing back a beer array, and this one should just be bringing back a normal type of beer. And this one, we're just going to comment out for now. So now we're building. Still got another error here, quickly fix this one up. So you can see some of the TypeScript things here. You start using TypeScript, it very much can feel like going to visit your grandmother's place. And I'm coming up with a few things here where it's going, oh, I don't like this, whereas in normal JavaScript, you could just punch it out. But here it's kind of making you, kind of setting boundaries to say that you've got to actually type this properly, and I've got to stay in the IDE and get it fixed. So let's keep plugging away at this, and let's do it one by one. So the first one here, we've got to get beers, saying that the interface does not implement type GetBeers of types iBeers scope on the beers controller incompatible. It's trying to take of iBeer. So we're bringing back a promise here should be of beer array. And then we're saving and we're all good. And we should be able to, at this point, build again. So this is kind of a classic example of when you start using TypeScript and JavaScript together. You'll get this kind of like, oh man, what's it not building? It's not building again, whereas in regular JavaScript it would. But once you've got it typed up and you get used to it, it's all pretty good. So let's now Control F5 and pop back into the browser again. And now we should be able to head over to our beers page and refresh, and hey presto, we're showing a list of beers. And if we check our network tab, what we can see is we're no longer calling our beers controller in our MVC project. We're actually calling our web API and calling out to API/beers API. So all is well. We have that. Let's actually now, we still can't really add a beer or show the beer form, but I'm not going to implement that just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to head over back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to wire up a service. So I'm going to pull this direct call out to Ajax call out, and I'm going to put it in a service. So to do that, I'm going to come over to Solution Explorer, hide the hidden files, right click on app, add a new folder, and I'm going to call that folder services. And inside there, I'm going to add a new TypeScript file called beers.service.ts. And before I forget, I'm going to pop over to our bundling and minification, and I am going to add the reference. So I'm going to just click on that row and Control CV to copy the line, put a comma in, get rid of that, and it's of type app, or in the directory at app services at beers.service.js, and I'm just going to always check the spelling there when I'm just typing that out. So beers.service.ts in services folder. So all looks good. Control save and build. And let's head back over to our beers service and type this out. So again, I'm going to put this in a module, and I'm going to call it app.services. And first thing I'm going to put at the top is a use strict statement, as per normal. Now I'm going to do an interface. And that interface is going to be of type iBeers service. And inside there, we're going to implement our function called GetBeers. And it's going to be of type, similar to the other controller, ng.iPromise, and it's going to take in a beer array. Oh, not a beer service, but a beer array, an array of beers. And you can see that what's happening is that Visual Studio and Intellisense is trying to help me out here, saying, hey, you've got a class called beer back in your beers controller. Do you want to reference that to be able to use this beer here? But really I want it to be the other way around. What I want to do is have my beer class in here and reference it in my controller. So I'm going to go do that. So I'm going to come over to my beers.controller, come up to my beer class. I'm going to cut it out, Control X, Control Save, and pop back over to my beer service and just Control V and pop it in there and save. And now we can see that if I hover over this, I've got a class of type beer inside this file. But I don't have it anymore over in my beer controller. And this is a TypeScript thing. We need to actually import it. So I could just use IntelliSense here or use the resharper tool hints and just attach that to every single beer reference here, but I don't want to do that. I want to put a variable at the top of this. So what I'm going to do is import beer, like so. And it's going to equal a app.services, and you can see the IntelliSense helping, .beer. But it's not there, my beer's not there. And that's because I haven't exported it. So if you want to import and export between these modules, then you need to put those words on the TypeScript. So if I go back over to the beer service, I can come over here and say export and save that. Oops. Yep, that's right. And also I want to export this class and save. And now you can see down here we've added that services.beer into the JavaScript for this class. I'm going to pop back over to the controller and I should be able to now get IntelliSense and go Control Spacebar and we see beer and push tab and life is good again. We get rid of all our red squigglies at our grandma's house. So now we're referencing beer here is actually referencing the imported beer from the services.beer. All is good. Let's head back over to our service and continue. So the next thing we need to do in our service here is we're going to actually need a class called beers service. And it's going to implement iBeer service. And it's going to have a static inject again, static $inject from the Angular service that equals an array of strings. And we're going to need that $HTTP, like so. And then I'm going to need a constructor. Oh, didn't finish off the bracket there. Put it in brackets, like so. And a semicolon, and we want to put constructor, and that constructor is going to be empty at this stage, but we want to implement a private, similar to what we did in the controller, a private $HTTP of type ng dot dollar, oh, not dollar, ng.ihttp service. And at this point, we have got our injected HTTP service to make our AJAX call, and we need to implement this interface. So I'm going to use resharper again and go Alt-Enter and implement missing members, and it's going to put in our GetBeers function, and I'm going to flip back to our beer.controller.ts and steal some of our code that we wrote here to put into our other controller. So I'm just going to copy that, come back over to the beer service and refactor here. And we have got a this.beers is not what we're actually putting it on. We're just going to return this as response and response.data. So just having a look here, what are we getting our red squigglies for? And we're just going to have to return this. And we should be good. So we're going to construct a private of this type that returns this .http and then returns a responsive then, and then puts that onto the, it's just thinking this through for a second. So what's happening here is that I've actually accidentally tried to stick it straight in the constructor when I'm cutting and pasting, an old cut and paste issue. So actually meant to stick it down here in the function. So just going to Control V, Control Paste. And now we've effectively wired up our GetBeers function, but we haven't finished implementing our Angular factory here for our service. So let's do that now. But one of the problems is with using TypeScript is if we start doing this and we go Angular.module of type app, and it's going to be a .factory, and that factory returns app.services.beers service like this, and then we pass it a beers service. This actual Angular factory is expecting to be passed an object, and we're not actually returning an object from this beer service class. So if we want to follow the style guide and use factories for our services, Angular factories, what we'll need to do is actually just return an object to our wiring up of the factory here. So I'm going to use a named function, and you can see resharper helping here called factory. And it's going to take in $HTTP, and we're going to type that to of type ng.I HTTP service, and we're going to inject that as we've done previously. But rather than doing a static method outside of our class here, I'm going to do regular JavaScript way of doing it, which would be to go $inject equals an array of strings, and we're going to pass into it $HTTP like so. And that needs to be in brackets like this. And all we're going to do here is just return this. We're going to go return a new beers service like this. Nice and simple. So, and we're going to pass in $HTTP. And all is well. So this is a bit of an extra step that we have to do to get this, just fix up some of the spelling there. Some of the extra steps we have to do with a TypeScript factory using Angular. And this is just how we roll sometimes with some of the TypeScript and Angular stuff. So I'm going to save that, and we're all running, and you can see that these is added, all of our JavaScript is compiling. We've made a reference in our bundle.config, and we should be able to pop back into our controller now and access this service. So rather than just calling the API just directly here, we need to inject our new service. So I'm going to do that up top here and go app.services.beers service, and I'm going to come down and make another private variable called beers service, and it's going to be of type, just give us a bit more room here, services.IBService. And then we can come down and rather than making this direct AJAX call here, we can defer that off to our new service, and we should get nice Intellisense for this. We should be able to go beers service and .getBeers, and we're not going to pass it in anything, and hey presto, we should be good. So now we're deferring off our logic for calling our AJAX call out to our service rather than doing it in our controller. So I'm just going to build, make sure we're building, and then Control F5 to run off to our browser, reopen our DevTools, go to our beers page, and we're getting an error here saying app.services.beers service must return a value from $getFactory method. So if we pop back over, what we're seeing is we need to, in our controller here, we're returning data, not response.data, save that, and Control F5 again. Go to our beers, refresh, and our factory method's not returning. So if I pop back over to our beers service, we can see at the bottom here, I need to not return the beers service, I actually need to return our factory object that we've created up here. So Control Save, make sure that's saving, and then Control F5 again. Back over to the browser, refresh our page. And now we're calling out, if we look at our network tab, we're calling out to our Beers API still. If we look at our sources, we can come down to our bundles and see we're actually bundling and minifying, but it's working. Why is that? Because we set up the $inject. But now we can't actually see the code that we want to step through here. So I'm going to pop back over into Visual Studio, go to our bundling and config, and turn off our enable optimizations equals true. And Control F5 to run again, pop back over and refresh. We should see the exact same page and loading our beers. But now if we look at our app folder, we have a services, we have a TypeScript service, and if we were to put a breakpoint on our GetBeer method, we can see here that if we refresh, we're calling out to GetBeers, and that's going to return us a response. And this response is going to have, sorry, I need to put that one up. Roll through that again. Our response has an object with 2 beers on it. So now we're effectively using our service for doing our AJAX call. So all is well. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to quickly wire up the rest of our form here so that we can use our new add beer, and we want to show and hide this form based off the variable show beer. So it should be pretty straightforward for us. If we pop back into Visual Studio, we go out to our beer controller and we finish our add beer method. It takes a type of beer of ng.iPromise. It's going to return off a post, and we're posting that new beer, and it's going to return to us a this dot beers equals beer.response data. So this dot beers, but we're actually going to come off and call our, we need to push it onto the array. So this dot beers dot push this response onto the end of our array. But we also want to put this out in our service as well, but we've seen this can be pretty quick to do. So if we Control C and copy the logic from there, head over to our service, we're going to implement an add beer method, and it's going to be of type ng.iPromise, and this should start to look familiar now, and it's going to be of type beer, not a beer array. And we're also going to put on here a show beer. Actually, we won't put that on here, we'll leave that on the other. And we've got this add beer, and we can use resharper to help us with the typing, implement missing members, come down, get rid of the throw new errors exception, Control V, and we need to pass in a type of new beer that is of type beer. And we're just going to return the beer like so. Return the response.data again. And that's going to be of type beer and beer here. So if we come back over to our beer controller, now we can do a very similar thing we did up here by accessing our beer service. So we're just going to get rid of this and go this.beers service dot add beer, and we're going to pass in the new beer. And we're going to push back onto the array, getting an error here saying doesn't supplied parameters do not match any signature of call target, expected 0 parameters. So we've probably forgotten to put those parameters up here. So add beer takes an add beer, so I'm just going to save that, head back over to our beer service, and add beer takes a new beer. So you can see again, TypeScript here really helping us out, keeping us in the IDE to prevent us from making these mistakes. So we're passing in a new beer. Now it's saying we've got an error here. Let's Control-Shift-Build. We're successfully building and our service is working. Now we can come back over to our beers controller, and all is wired up there, and we should be able to push this back onto the back of the array. But before we do that, we need to be able to show the show beer form function down here working. So this show beer form takes a boolean called show beer. So I'll just type that, and all it does is go this dot show beer equals show beer that we're passing in, and we can save that. And we've set up on the constructor that this dot show beer equals false when we first load the page. And we also need to actually come in here and say, okay, so we're going to call out to our service and add this new beer and return it and then push it onto the end of the array here. But what we also need to do is go this dot show beer equals false, so that we close the form after we've added a beer. We also need to clear off the new beer object. So we go this dot new beer equals an empty object. But you'll see that TypeScript's throwing an error here because saying, hey, this is meant to have an ID, but because it's of type beer. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to cast it to an any, and that'll help us out. And we can just highlight that, Control-K-F to refactor and save that, and build. And all is good. Control-F5 to head back over to our view, load up our beers page, refresh. We're hitting our breakpoint from before, roll through, and you can see we're getting our list. We should be able to click add beer and it shows up form, push cancel and it closes the form. And we should be able to go, I'm going to add a beer of Corona, and it's going to be of color bright, and I'm going to tick that I have tried and push add. And you'll see here that it's, for some reason, we've got an error. So let's have a look at why that didn't bind to our page. And I've got a feeling if we had in a Visual Studio, it's going to be on our index page. So we've got this vm.newBeer of name and color and has tried, and we're passing up a new beer, and we're showing and hiding's working. Name, color, and has tried. So all looks good here for passing up this variable of a new beer when we click add beer here. So let's have a look at our controller as the next step. Come down to our add beer, and that's taking in a new beer of type beer. Save that, and that should be passing that off to the service, and it is passing off a new beer of type beer. And if we come down, add new beer of type beer, We're passing that into our post. So all should be good. So if we build this and head back over to our browser, run our beers, you can see that it entered it right, but it didn't push it back onto the array before when we wanted it. So let's try that again. Let's try Corona 2, and it's going to be of bright color, and let's push add. And we're still not binding that back on. So I think we've got an issue here with our push method when we're pushing it back onto the array. So if we go into our controller, we're saying this.beers.push, and we shouldn't be adding on the response. We should just be adding the data like this, and save, and head back over to Visual Studio. Go to our beers. Let's add a third Corona now, getting close to the end of our video, called bright, and push add. And you can see it's pushing that back onto the end of the array there, and if we refresh, we can see our list of beers. So all is well here, and we have a functioning extension using TypeScript with Angular. So let's recap here what we've done. What we've done is we made a new controller in TypeScript, and we used interfaces and we used classes to be able to do that. We made it minification safe with our $inject service, which we put on as a static member to the beer controller class. And we refactored to use controllers. We saw that we got a lot of help using ReSharper with our typing, and also our Intellisense from using TypeScript. So as you can see, you're going to do a lot more coding with TypeScript. Up front, you're going to write a lot more code, but ReSharper can help with that. And in the long run, you're going to be faster and save some time. And we've seen that if you're going to use TypeScript, you really want to type all of the typings as much as you can and avoid the any keyword. And this is kind of one of the big benefits. The other big benefit is in some of the toolings, in terms of being able to go to definition like you would be used to in C#, or also be able to do a right-click refactor and rename because it's based off the symbol versus the string with TypeScript. So these are some of the benefits we're now going to be able to get in this application. And I wanted to also say a huge thanks to my mate Justin, who has a great course on Pluralsight called Building Enterprise Applications or Large Applications for AngularJS with TypeScript. And if you wanted to take this a step further, I highly recommend going and checking it out. And that's our Dev SuperPowers webinar for today. Thanks for watching. Cheers.